thank our sponsors, the City of Monterey, Cannery Row Company, Cannery Row Foundation, and the Western Flyer Foundation. We are happy to welcome Emily Gottlieb, who is the Education Director for the Western Flyer Foundation, and will moderate today's discussion. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Francesca. Thanks again to the Monterey Public Library for putting these events on. Well, welcome everybody. It is my pleasure today to announce our speakers, Steve and Mary Albert. Steve and Mary are a local husband and wife team whose award-winning documentaries have been shown at scientific institutions across the country, from Sitka, Alaska's Natural History Museum to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. So Steve and Mary are going to give a brief introduction to their film before we get to watch it all together. So welcome, Steve and Mary.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary. This is Steve. We're going to talk for just a couple minutes to give a little Cannery Row context to our movie which is called The Great Tidepool. Then we're going to show the film, and then afterwards we'll return for a discussion wherever that may lead us with questions and answers, hopefully. So we know that Ed Ricketts and Cannery Row are really one and the same. The book, Steinbeck's wonderful book, Cannery Row, immortalizes that idea for him as a person in the form of his character Doc. But not just his personality, but his science is also really closely linked to Cannery Row, the place. His lab was there. We've all walked by there. Some of us have been inside. He collected there. He was close to the people who lived there and the fishermen who worked there. The fishermen did collecting for him, and he would use the sardine catch and especially the byproduct of the sardine catch to see really what was out there in the bay and in the ocean. And he conducted ecological studies about the Monterey Bay. In some ways, Ed Ricketts' science, his scientific system, and his ecological approach culminates in his conclusions about the sardine fishing in Monterey Bay and its effect on the sardine populations. Yeah, we're just going to share the screen here for a brief moment. Oh, the host has disabled screen sharing. I think Francesca's enabling. Okay, whoop, wrong way. Okay, here we go.
So this is an article written by Ed Ricketts in the Monterey Peninsula Herald in 1947 in March. It's part of the 12th annual sardine edition. So the Herald would have an annual sardine edition. And he contributed this article, which I'm sure some of you have seen or heard about. And you can see what it's titled, Science Studies the Sardine. This is Ed Ricketts' scientific approach and his conversation about the Cannery Row sardine catch. For us, this article is well worth reading. So if you haven't read it, it's pretty short. You can get it at the Monterey Library online collection. It's right there. And it just does a lot of things for us as far as explaining Ed Ricketts, his position, and his science. First of all, it does three things. First of all, it shows how we think, and I think it does a pretty good job, showing how Ed Ricketts never underestimates anybody, all people. In this article, he's really trying to explain something pretty groundbreaking to a general populace. Remember, this is just a local newspaper. He explains an ecological point of view, and he's trying to convince people everything is connected to everything else. You know, he offers an ecological explanation of the sardine crash in Monterey Bay. That's why for us it's an important thing to look at, because he's trying to communicate it to everybody. And he does a good job. He communicates something, and I think he does it so easily, and it's a really complex idea. In this article, he actually explains how plankton are fed by certain temperatures in the ocean, and those plankton then bloom, which feed the sardines. And he talks about sardines needing a certain kind of fat content before they start reproducing in mass. So he's connecting the kind of atmospheric and oceanic conditions to the plankton blooms connected to the sardines and how much fat they have. And depending on how much fat they have, they reproduce in a certain way. He calls them, I think, reproduction machines. I like to call them as sex machines. You know, these sardines just reproduce. That's what they do, but only if they have a certain level of fat content in their body. So if you can somehow understand this, he says, if we could get this information and data to the fishermen, then they can kind of see or predict when sardines will blossom themselves because they eat the plankton. So when they have the fat and they reproduce a lot, then might be a good time to fish. But if you can see a moment when the plankton is low or when there's not as much upswelling in the ocean, you might hold back and allow those sardines to grow up later and then the next year fish. A complicated article, and I'm not even explaining it as well as he does. He just does it so simply and so easily. And I think it's one of the great things about Ed Ricketts. Thirdly, I think the article shows, again, his effective use of language. You know, we looked at a lot of his notebooks and the way he writes and the way he talks about ecology and the way he talks about creatures. And one thing we found littered through the notebooks is this kind of very personable way of looking at creatures and ecology. He uses very easy language. When you read the Between Pacific Tides, it's right there in those pages. And if you read this quote, I'm going to read it for you. He's talking about the sardine crash in Monterey Bay. And he says, the answer, in other words, here's why. The answer to the question, where are the sardines, becomes quite obvious in this light. They're in cans. And it's just such a powerful, simple 2 sentences. And it explains so much about his thinking. And for me, that's why this article, and Mary, is just an important touch point. And I think it should be part of, you know, for me, that quote should be on every ecologist's wall somewhere framed, because I just think it explains so much. Anyway, you know, our movie explains what we found out about Ed Ricketts' scientific system. And our movie, if you're still there at the end, our movie ends with some of his original notebook musings on the sardine crash. And, you know, that kind of happened accidentally. They're very poetic to me anyway. And when I read this article, I kind of feel like we ended it the right way. And hopefully the quote is on long enough during the movie. And he talks about the sardine crash, and not about the sardine crash and why it happened, but after the sardine crash, what else happened throughout the Monterey Bay's ecosystem, which is kind of nice. He's just always thinking.
So let's stop the share. Oh, no, sorry. I got it. We want to, well, we hope you enjoy the movie, and we will be back in about half an hour. I want to make sure that everyone enjoys the movie without it stuttering. And sometimes what happens is when you show a movie on Zoom, it has that effect. If that happens to you, feel free to go over to a different website, which is on the screen right now. And I think Francesca has a link to it in the chat, www.thegreattidepool.org, just as you see it up there. And you can just click right on the movie and watch it, and then come on back and we will have the discussion.
But it might play just fine through Zoom.
It might play just fine through Zoom. You just never know.
Oh, tell them that too.
So we live in Pacific Grove. We're from Pacific Grove. Ed Ricketts lived in Pacific Grove. And his original lab, we all know his lab in Cannery Row. His original lab before that was in Pacific Grove. If you've ever been to Kidwell's paint store down on 14th Street, no, Fountain, on Fountain, that was Ed Ricketts' original lab. And so you'll see a map in our film that identifies where the lab is, and it's in Pacific Grove. That's just a little
PG bias.
PG bias there. Okay, so we will see you, and I'm going to stop sharing and move over to Emily. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we're ready to start the film. Hi everyone, sorry about that. I neglected to click the share computer sound. Here we go, and you will be able to hear it now.
Pacific Grove, California. The intertidal zone. Life between low tide and high tide. Where in the 1930s, marine biologist Ed Ricketts embarked on a monumental effort to collect detailed ecological data. He focused on the creatures and their physical surroundings, on their habitats and on their interconnections. And in the process, Ricketts discovered a new way to look at the natural world. Through his scientific methods, Ricketts systematically translated what he experienced collecting along the Pacific coast, and especially his experiences at a small boulder-strewn tidal flat here in Pacific Grove, California, a place Ricketts called the Great Tidepool. Centuries before Ed Ricketts, in 18th century Sweden, Carl Linnaeus was at the forefront of a movement to classify all living creatures. He believed that everything on Earth was placed here by God, and if Linnaeus organized it all, he would reveal God's divine order. In Linnaeus's great book, System of Nature, that is just what he did. He grouped things in a hierarchy of shared physical characteristics. For example, what was always simply a brownish snail living on the shore was redefined by Linnaeus's new point of view. It was given its fixed place in God's ordered world. Linnaeus categorized all creatures by their physical characteristics and created a naming system we still use today. Ed Ricketts, renowned Pacific Coast marine biologist, extraordinary observer of the natural world, and with his friend Jack Calvin, author of the classic seashore guidebook, Between Pacific Tides, the first book to organize creatures by communities living in habitats. For example, the octopus is organized with the group of creatures that live in the rocky shores and are primarily found in the low tide horizon under rocks. It shares this space in the book with algae, anemones, starfish, crabs, hydroid sponges, and snails, just as Ricketts saw them share space in the tide pool. And he describes a creature's behavior as he personally experienced it. Ricketts writes, "The octopus moves rapidly by the use of its arms and suckers, and to take them with bare hands is almost impossible." Ricketts spent hours, days, years in the tide pools, collecting creatures and observing closely their habits and habitats. He learned from these experiences that he needed to do more than just categorize the creatures and plants the traditional way. So he developed his own scientific system based on relations. It took in the whole situation of the tide pool, from the hours of sunlight, to the force of the waves, to the community of creatures and how it all interrelated. It was designed to redescribe and reclassify the tide pool, but it did much more than that. It was a new way to look at the natural world. It all begins with a typical collecting trip. A typical summer's morning at the Great Tidepool. Ed Ricketts' trusted collecting spot. In the 1920s, most people visiting the Great Tidepool were not familiar with the terms habitat or ecosystem. But habitats and ecosystems were at the front of marine biologist Ed Ricketts' mind. And as a professional collector at the Great Tidepool, he was confronted with dramatically different habitats within the space of a few yards and a few hours. For example, he saw that within a few yards, some of the shore was exposed to massive wave shock, while other parts were calm and protected. At noon, the sea was 5 feet deep. But within just a few hours, all the water had drained away. These easily perceived variations were observable on a human scale. Ricketts didn't need seasons and years or to trek through mountains and valleys to observe great differences. And with an abundance of creatures packed in just a few square feet, the Great Tidepool was a perfect showcase for the new science of habitat. Ricketts' intimate knowledge of differences in habitats helped him find specimens for his collecting business, Pacific Biological Laboratories, where he preserved and mounted zoological specimens from starfish to Polyorchis, the bell jelly. The specimens were cataloged and priced for prospective buyers. From the Great Tidepool to the lab to a jar, and on to schools, scientists, and museums. The preserved creatures helped scientists around the world to understand marine invertebrates. But of more lasting value to the world was the information he preserved through his detailed, complex, and comprehensive scientific system. Ricketts kept his ideas and observations in notebooks. They hold his scientific methods and techniques and are the basis for his major study of the Pacific coast. In large, ledger-sized notebooks, Ricketts logged his personally observed ecological data from his tidepool collecting trips. On one morning's collecting trip, his data includes observations of 80 different species, including number 21, the brooding anemone, Epiactis prolifera, and number 69, the kelp crab, Pugetia producta. His collecting trip notes describe the animal's situation specifically. He notes the lined chiton, Tonacella, is on top of the rock, but almost never occurs under the rock. The mossy chiton, Mopalia, is exposed on top of the rock, but tends to be masked by seaweed. Raymondi is found either under the rock itself or in a ledge or crevice. Through observations like these, Ricketts discovers that he is able to categorize chitons by habitat. He concludes certain chitons are likely to be found on top and on the sides of rocks out of the tide, fully exposed, while others live on the side of the rock in substratum, partially protruding into the light. And a third group are completely underneath the rocks buried lightly. Here, Ricketts discovers a new way to see chitons. At the end of a collecting day, Ricketts took the notebooks back to the lab and turned them into formal data. Each collecting trip became one revised collecting report. Here, his notebook entry about the tentacles of the worm Ceratulus is directly logged into the revised collecting report. His thousands of tidepool collecting trips are formalized into pages and pages of typed permanent records of seashore findings. These formal data were then broken down and logged onto Pacific Biological Laboratory survey cards, like this one for Ceratulus. A Pacific Biological Laboratory survey card unites the accumulated observations of a particular creature from different collecting trips. Each card starts with the creature's Linnaean taxonomy and is followed by information on the observed situation of the creature. Was it found in a gravel or a sand-type bottom? Was it found at the low tidal horizon or the high tidal horizon? What was its exposure to the surf? Position on a rock? There was space for anything else Ricketts had noted in the field, and space on the back for recording multiple collecting trips spanning many years. All of Ricketts' field observations from places like the Great Tidepool were formalized into this vast database of 4x6 cards. Ricketts' industrious efforts led to an unparalleled data set of observations, creature after creature. Thousands of trips to the tide pools, noted, revised, categorized, and filed onto the survey cards. Hundreds of creatures, thousands of creatures, tens of thousands of habitat-focused data points, dutifully transferred onto the survey cards and filed away for future use by Ricketts himself. These cards themselves are among the first attempts to scientifically log the habits and habitats of the creatures in an entire ecosystem. Monterey Bay fishermen like Vito Bruno and Chin Yip provided Ricketts with specimens and data, as did the large purse seine fishermen's nets brought into Hovden's cannery by the sardine fishermen. Collectors of particular ability provided inventory for the business, like Mr. A.O. Chandler of Aptos, who provided Ricketts frogs, and Mr. E.G. Sack, who would help him find eels, if Ricketts could make the trip. Others like Mr. Harold Bicknell and Mr. Stanley Erickson were generalist collectors. They found it useful to carry a letter from Ricketts in their wallets, clarifying their collecting activities. Scientists and specialists across the country helped Ricketts identify creatures by mail, like the beach hoppers he often collected at night. In one case, he identified a beach hopper as corniculata. He shipped the specimen to C.R. Shoemaker at the Smithsonian for confirmation, who then identified the specimen as Californiana, leading Ricketts to revise his collecting report. Ricketts read others' academic research at the Berkeley and Stanford University libraries. This yielded notebooks and 3x5 bibliographic cards that were packed with information from past research on creatures, like the seminal work on crabs by Mary J. Rathbun. Ricketts' network was broad. From University of Chicago professors, the ecology pioneers, Professors Alley and Shelford, to Monsieur Gautier of Bridlington, England, the Houdini of the water, for whom Ricketts shipped across the Atlantic a well-preserved giant octopus. Ricketts' ambition, ideas, and connections knew no boundaries. Ricketts' investigations were summarized on the MasterCard of the system, the species card. On the front side, a path to the species' traditional facts, its most current Linnaean taxonomy, its place in the standard published reference books, its recent Pacific occurrences as described in the academic literature, and the facts of the preserved specimens themselves. On the reverse side, a path to Ricketts' personal ecological data set on the species, a summary of its observed physical features and ecology as drawn from Ricketts' immense note-taking, its geographic range as identified from Ricketts' vast collecting trips noted on his survey cards, and its predominant ecological niche as determined by direct observations from Ricketts and other experts with whom he consulted. Finally, the species-designated ecological niche is edge-notched, so that a stack of cards, usually filed by Linnaean taxonomy, could be retrieved and rearranged by like edge notches, resulting in a set of cards instantly reorganized by a particular habitat. Creatures that had for centuries been arranged in one way are quickly and accurately reclassified and redescribed by habitat. Between Pacific Tides. An account of the habits and habitats of some 500 of the common conspicuous seashore invertebrates of the Pacific coast between Sitka, Alaska, and northern Mexico. The treatment is ecological and inductive. That is, the animals are treated according to their most characteristic habitat, and in the order of their commonness, conspicuousness, and interest. Ricketts took the Great Tidepool's spectacle of habitats and used his explorative, open scientific methods and his natural, honest writing style to communicate the complexities of an ecosystem to even the casual visitor to the tide pools. It was the first time the ecological approach was delivered in an accessible way to the layman. This was the first time that any book had been organized by habitat. So the table of contents becomes a contents and directory of habitats. The basic and traditional tidal zones are part of the structure: high tide horizon, mid-tide horizon, low tide horizon. But his system is more accurate than that. For example, in the protected outer coast on the rocky shore at mid-tide under a rock, there you would expect to find the brittle star Amphiotia occidentalis alongside the porcelain crab, hermit crab, and turban snail. However, in the protected outer coast, in the rocky shore in the low tide horizon, under a rock there, you might be lucky and find the rare furry crab, Hapalogaster cavilcuva. While in the rocky shore at mid-tide, in a tide pool, you would most likely see the blue-banded hermit crab, Pagurus samuelis, sea anemone, and a swath of red algae. Ricketts' scientific system flows directly into the pages of Between Pacific Tides. Habitats he uncovered in his research frame his ecological, hands-on descriptions of the ecosystems and the creatures. Reading the book is like being guided habitat by habitat through the tide pools by Ed Ricketts, with all his notebooks, survey cards, and species cards at hand. In Between Pacific Tides, the pages that follow each habitat describe an animal community. In this way, the book builds connections between creatures and their surroundings, between creatures and creatures. The book and his system reflect Ed Ricketts' obvious talent at making detailed observations and his uncanny ability to see and build connections. He beautifully demonstrates this in one of his last notebook entries from one of his last collecting trips to the Great Tidepool. He observes a jellyfish population explosion in the Great Tidepool ecosystem and connects it to the overfishing of sardines in Monterey Bay. Here and throughout his work, Ricketts foreshadows the pervasive ecological perspective of the 21st century. Namely, everything is connected to everything. The book most beautifully supports the idea that the ecologist's point of view, based on habitats, is an advantageous and accurate way to view the tide pools and perhaps to view the world. The last entry in Ricketts' notebook is written by his friend, John Steinbeck, who briefly notes the tragic end of one of the greatest scientific observers of the natural world.
Ooh.
That was so wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank
I
you.
love the ending. It's so playful.
See, you know, people, we didn't realize they couldn't see that article. Can I share my screen again and see if I can get that article up there?
That'd be great. Yeah, let's take a couple minutes to do that before we jump into the Q&A. Yeah, now we can see it.
Can everybody see it now? So the reason why we're so excited about this article, for us anyway, is that, like I said, Ed Ricketts tries to communicate something very complex to everyone. He's just not talking to other academics or other scientists. And for us, that's an important thing, because we like to do that with our movies, by the way, but also it's just who he is. You know, when we look at his notebooks and see what he writes, he's just, I know he has a checkered other part of him, but in his science and the way he conducts his science, it's a very friendly way to do things. And, you know, by the way, we bump into a lot of marine biologists and a lot of them are friendly. Maybe it's just part of the DNA, I don't know. They really are. And
helpful and always want to
open,
share their material. And yeah.
And so people like Professor Gilly and John Pierce, Mark Denny,
Pierce and Vicky Pierce, and
just wide open scientists, helpful.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's the part I was talking about. So Ed Ricketts wrote this article and he wrote it to everyone. And you can see right down here somewhere, he's talking about plankton and diatoms and, you know, oceanic pastures and all sorts of stuff in the local newspaper. I just think that's wonderful. And here are the quotes I thought every marine biologist or ecologist should have on their wall. The answer to the question, where are the sardines, becomes quite obvious in this light. They're in cans. And I just love how I know it may not be what we'd all do, but he's apostrophe, you know, just a friendly conversation. They're in cans.
And we know that there's been, you know, there's debate about his conclusions, but it's his process. It's his ecological approach that we find so compelling, and the way he communicates.
And I also like how he was, even then, delivering data like this, mapping things. And there's another page that I don't have here where there's more data about temperatures, and he talks about scientists who collect data and they should make it available to everybody. And he talks about a scientist in La Jolla, and he talks about, you know, the research they're doing, all in this little article, trying to convince people that you can do something about the sardine fishery. So we're more than happy to take questions, and I've got to be careful because I can blab, 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 talk and talk and talk for as long as anybody wants. So I think I'll try to close my mouth here. But this is something Mary and I put together that describes what we think is Ed Ricketts' scientific system. And we have a little booklet that describes each one of these colored pathways. And essentially each pathway is a kind of information flow that ends up in these products. And all of this stuff you see on this slide are things he explains in his notebooks. We kind of got the explanations and put it in this diagram, but each one of these pathways of information are explained by him as pathways. And he has this incredible system where he has stamps that he's created that are cross-referencing stamps. So you'll see in his notebook a stamp that has a blank spot so that he can fill it in to tell you to go to this other notebook where you might find some more information, or you go to a reference book to find information, or you go to one of his collecting cards to find information.
And it's also really for himself so that he can keep track of where he has all his data and how it links to each other. And he knows that if he's got that stamp on the card or on the collecting, the day's collecting trip, he knows where that information has gone and when it went and who confirmed it. And, you know, it's kind of just this amazing link to the connections in his brain. And at some point the film really is only just a tiny portion of what he did, obviously. So when we finally figured out if we could get it down in this diagram like this and make our little booklet, because at one point we figured out that we kind of had it all in our head and we knew we never would be able to again. So we got it all down on one little diagram here. But
so finally, and then I will be quiet, I promise. But finally, when you look through his notebooks and look at the systems that he used, this map or diagram, I'm sure he would be very comfortable with. It's just the way his brain seemed to work, to organize, organize, and organize. And we had the lucky chance to go up and talk to his daughter up in Sitka, and we had a cup of coffee with her in her house, and she had never really seen this system or thought about the cards or the way he conducted his science. And she took us into her laundry room to find something, and we went to her laundry room, and she had 3 filing cabinets of information filed and cataloged immaculately. It was beautiful. And we just looked at each other and said, there's something going on here, because it wasn't just Ed, it was everybody. Yeah. It seemed.
The family had
his son too,
and
had his
Ed
jazz data
everything.
Just collected perfectly.
Yeah.
Okay, now I will talk. We'll stop.
Well, this is great. I'm gonna start off with a question that I have, and then we'll kind of go into the chat and people can unmute themselves. But I'm curious, just in general, what drew you to telling this story? And if you could talk a little bit about your process with uncovering his system of thinking too, and how much of that came to you as you were making the film, or how much of it you knew ahead of time and that's what attracted you to it.
Yeah, we didn't know a lot ahead of time. We had made a few other films, and we had his book, and we wanted to make a film. We started out, we're going to make a film about the tide pool, because, you know, it's a great thing to make a film about. And we found ourselves using Between Pacific Tides.
This version,
more and more. And, you know, we have a lot of books about, we like to do a lot of research. Our films, maybe you can tell, are all pretty academically oriented, and we don't, you know, we like to base it on a lot of close research. And so we had a lot of guidebooks, we had a lot of books, we were collecting books, we were, you know, consulting different things. And crazily enough, we found ourselves going back to Between Pacific Tides more and more and more, because of his descriptions, because the way he has the book organized. And we thought it was kind of crazy. Here's this book, you know, with black and white photos from 1939 that, you know, there are many more modern books that you would think might be more useful. But in fact, the book is just,
it explains so
much so easily. And so once you're in the tide pool all the time, it's just perfect. And so we became interested in him, you know, who we had heard of him. We knew Doc Ricketts, we knew who he was, but we really were fascinated by this book. And we kind of knew someone that we sort of somehow knew, oh, this book is different. And anyway, we started talking to different people, bumped into Don Kors at the Hopkins Library. Actually, we ran into the cards that he had put online. And this treasure trove of cards opened up, and then we got to know Don and went up to the Stanford Library and did more research, which was, you know, fantastic.
That was amazing, going to the Stanford Library and getting his original notebooks and opening them up and reading them entirely, everything he had written in those papers. And we started to realize that he was explaining his science, and we had never seen it written down anywhere. We'd never seen it written down in that way, the way he conducted his science, you know, the way he collected things, the way he put his collection together, his ambitions with his science. He writes it in his notebook, and just one thing kept leading to another, and it was like an addiction, really. And so at some point, the movie just went from Tide Pool to Ed Ricketts, and then that was it. We have a whole half of another movie that has nothing to do with Ed Ricketts, and then that one's thrown away somewhere. But the fascination of his brain was really, and his science. So when you start to, then we start to think about Ed Ricketts, we start to explore, and other people have done a lot of things about Ed Ricketts, and you can't do everything. And we would love to talk about Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck, but other people have done a pretty good job with that. Yeah. So we figured maybe we'll do something else, and this was really what we like, and so this is how it ended up.
Fantastic. Well, thanks. So here's a question coming in from the chat box from Linda. So she's asking, in the film, there are the black and white clips of Ed Ricketts collecting. Can you talk a little bit about filming those and what that was like, or putting those together?
Yeah, Linda, we've shown this film for years and years around the world, and you're the first person to ask that question. We've always wondered, why isn't anyone asking about that? Well, go ahead, Steve.
It was a blast. It was so much fun. And that's where we were mentally, like we walked around in those tide pools, and you start to understand why people like Ed Ricketts, why people who are marine biologists love what they do so much. I mean, it's just fun. It feels good. It smells good. It's just one of those things where, I don't know, I would bump into John Piers every once in a while, and it was like he had crawled out of a tide pool sometimes, and I was just so jealous. And we would walk around filming so much, and then we realized, there is no footage of Ed Ricketts in a tide pool, but you know what?
It was our fantasy.
Let's do it. And then we sort of tried to get some boots that looked like him and figured out what it must be like to do it. And
that's Steve.
And that's me in the tide pool. But the fact is, when you read his notebooks, he loves being in the tide pools. Ed Ricketts loves being in the tide pools. What's the one quote?
Yeah, I guess, what are you thinking after he had been working in the lab during World War II, and then he wrote to somebody, I'm sure, Susan, you probably know this quote, but he wrote to somebody and said something like, I can't wait to, I'm so glad I can get back to work and really get back with the creatures.
Yeah, I'm finding myself more and more, what I like to do is be with the creatures in the tide pool. I think we're all there at some point.
Well, that's fantastic. That must have been a lot of fun to film.
Yeah.
So this question comes in from Marcia, and I think a few of our viewers might be wondering this: where exactly is the Great Tidepool? And to your knowledge, has anyone studied the habitat of the Great Tidepool lately to see how it's changed since Ricketts was working there?
I don't know if,
No,
that would be something for the Hopkins student to do, I imagine. And maybe they have. I know there are some places where, when we were in Sitka, actually, they had records of where Ricketts had done a survey, and they did a kind of anniversary survey. But as far as I know, nobody's done that at the Great Tidepool.
The Great Tidepool is, if you know where the little church, where the cemetery is in Pacific Grove, there's a road that goes down from the lighthouse to the coast, and it's right opposite the lighthouse on the coast. And if you go to super low tide, you will see it. It's obvious. You go to super low tide.
There's also a sign there now, the Great Tidepool. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I'll plug this. We're trying to make it a place of significant California significance.
Huh.
Which is an official designation to get a plaque and everything.
Yeah.
Oh, I just have a card that I got on that. Actually, how to get a plaque up for some place. That's good. Good for you.
Yeah.
Would anyone, any of the participants, like to unmute themselves to ask a question?
I would like to know, in reading his scientific notebooks, I don't know if I've actually read them all, but does he talk about things other than science within the context of the notebooks, or is it all science, or does he talk about art and literature? I mean, the ones I've read, he kind of mixes up everything, so it's braided.
I think braided is a good word.
Braided is a great word, yeah. I think in the major, the new series notebooks, it's pretty well,
It's what happens is that the new series notebooks, which is what we focused on, which was the scientific stuff,
is collecting notebooks.
And then inside the folders there's a lot of loose leaf things that he's written and typed out. And maybe that's something we didn't pay enough attention to.
But, now that I think about it, I think there are other things. Sometimes in the notebooks, it'll be just long lists of things to take on a trip, or you know, it's not strictly just collecting.
Mm.
Yeah.
I would give you a I don't recall.
Yeah. They're worth looking at though.
But he has some
Next time
beautiful,
you're-
if you've bumped into anything, he has a couple drawings of sea anemone, colored painted sea anemone paintings, which are kind of pretty.
Yeah, really.
Sea anemones, when Steinbeck was training to go on Sea of Cortez, Steinbeck's little experiment was with sea anemones. So he was trying to anesthetize them, and that was part of his early training in science.
Right.
Do you, I mean, we know that we know the phrase that the collection at Stanford was given to them by Steinbeck, but I only know it as a phrase. Do you know any truth to that?
The collection at Stanford was originally at Hopkins because it went from Ricketts' lab to Hopkins when Ricketts died, especially the scientific notebooks. That's where he wanted it to go. And an early researcher actually took the material.
Oh.
And his claim was that Hopkins gave it to him. I don't know what happened. I can't imagine that boxes and boxes would just, you know, go out of Hopkins, but that's what happened to it. So basically from about 1970 until 1992, the material was not available. And then it was returned or donated to Stanford again in 1992. So that's why Ricketts, you know, there was sort of an explosion of interest in Ricketts. So I read it then. I haven't been back to read it as fully since. That's why I can't remember all the, you know, everything. But it's kind of an interesting story that it was gone for so long. And
inside the materials, one really fun thing is these collecting cards that you see we show are actually the second version of collecting cards because the lab having burned down. But when you go to the actual notebooks and the material they have there, they have a small stack of cards about this big in a plastic envelope, and they have burned edges.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, they do. It's pretty exciting. And you know, when you know everything and you're flipping through this material and you see it, you kind of pause, and then you realize those cards aren't as sophisticated, and they're like the 1929 version of his cards, because he's constantly updating this system, constantly tweaking it, twiddling with it. And it's like everything is always in flux moving forward with something quote unquote new, you know?
New and better, and how he was gonna, he has whole pages with cards, you know, taped in there, and then notes about how to improve the cards and how the next version of the card is gonna have a better, you know, system, and constantly improving.
He has cards explaining to people how to fill out the cards. Has cards telling people how to type the card. I mean, he has little clips to put on it. It's a real odd sensation once you start to realize that it's never going to end. I don't think it would have never ended. It got more and more complex. He has good drawings of his lab that he is kind of fantasizing about, showing all the different tanks he wants and the cat embalming area,
the dead cat storage area.
And you know, when you read this material, you know, John Steinbeck does a good job of explaining how it felt, I imagine, maybe, you know, to be in Cannery Row. But when you read the notes and the cards, he's telling you what's in that book all the time. There's frog collection tanks in the lab, you know, and if you know the book well enough and you know the story about frog collecting well enough, it's just fascinating to see a tank in his lab that's for frogs. You know, there's just something there about that really, really just, you know, touches you. And then it goes a little fast in the movie, but there's a letter that we found. It's folded up. It was folded up and just stuck somewhere. It's just a nothing thing. And you unfold this letter, and it's the letter those Mac and the boys, right? Mm-hmm. It's the letter that Doc Ricketts or Ed Ricketts gave them, so that if somebody tapped them on the shoulder and said, "Why are you stealing our frogs?"
or whatever it might happen,
whatever it might be, they would give them this letter.
saying Ed Ricketts gives me permission to do this.
Just so charming, you know.
Yeah.
Well, charming, I don't know what's the word
Oh
is.
yeah, totally charming.
But those kind of things, when you know the book well enough and then you read those things in his notebooks, it's just one of those moments that feels.
And you realize how brilliantly Steinbeck was able to actually portray it.
In such a thin little book.
Yeah, just beautiful.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. And it goes on and on, really. I mean, on the collecting cards, you see where he gets his information, and it's like a cast of characters. It's just a cast of characters. Chin Yip, who else? He mentions a lot of fishermen by name. It's just not that one we show in the movie. There's a lot of fishermen by name who collected.
And in Santa Cruz as well. And
yeah. And where he talks to the fishermen about what they've caught, all sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah, I loved all those details and kind of thinking about the network that he created too, and how he would send letters to get things identified. It was just really, all really wonderful. It sounds like you have inspired some of our audience members to go visit the tide pools. Gina is asking what the best way is to visit the tide pools and walk in a way to avoid harming animals. So can you provide any insight from your time filming there?
Yeah.
Tread lightly.
Tread lightly and go at low tide, and always remember not to turn your back on the ocean. That's it. And be careful, you know, that it's so tempting to keep going out further and further and further, and then you turn around and realize you've got a long way to come back. You know, you can see quite a lot without going too far out.
But personally, I'm torn by that question. I'm completely torn. I don't want anybody to go into the tide pools, and yet they're so attractive and clearly so much fun, but every time you step on a rock, it feels like you're killing something. So it's a difficult question. And in between Pacific tides, Ed Ricketts talks about, you know, when a college class has come to visit the tide pool, he said, because when you go there, all the rocks are turned over and misplaced and everything's a tumble. So my answer is don't go to the tide pool.
And, you know, one time we showed this film with some of the Asilomar Rangers, and the first thing that happened after the film was Lisa Bradford jumped up and said she just wanted everyone to know that it is completely illegal to take anything out of the tide pool. And although, you know, collecting was something that Ed Ricketts did, this is not something that is allowed today. So we always want to make sure that people know not to take anything out. You know, turn over the rock, see what you can see underneath. The best advice I can give, I think, is to pick a spot and just slow down. If you walk and walk and walk and walk and look, you're not going to see much. But if you find a comfortable-ish rock to sit on, and you can sit and look down for as long as you have, things will appear. You'll start to hear the crabs, you know, in the rocks nearby you, and you'll start to see things, you know, emerge, and you'll probably see little fish, and you'll see all kinds of stuff.
Patience,
so
you're absolutely right.
And slowing down, and just stay in one spot. Don't feel like you got to keep walking. And that's good for not killing a lot of stuff too.
That's all great advice for being out there. Stay low and slow, right?
That's it.
There's at our website, one of our favorite quotes is Ed Ricketts talks about how if a wave comes to crash, the best move is to simply cling on to the rock like a starfish and just let it crash over you. And I keep thinking that it was a life lesson of some kind. I don't know, just hold on.
Good advice for life.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have time for probably one more question. And I see somebody's hand is raised in the audience, although I don't see the name. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask, go for it.
Yes, my name is Gay O'Runyon. And I'd like to know if Between Pacific Tides had a second name along with Ricketts, who was involved in that book. I didn't catch it when it was up on the screen, but
yeah, Jack Calvin.
And who is this Jack Calvin?
It's Jack Calvin. Well, if you live in Alaska, Sitka, Alaska, you might be more familiar. Yeah, Jack Calvin lived here in Pacific Grove, didn't he? Yeah. And I feel terrible with more expert people here. I'm looking at you, Susan. But I think that Jack Calvin was a photographer, did a lot of the writing. Supposedly, there's a lot of, there are the Jack Calvin fans who say that it's his book. And of course, there are the Ed Ricketts people who say it's his book. For me, I think it's a great, great, great example. I mean, I think it's an Ed Ricketts book, but Ed Ricketts was absolutely not concerned with credit and taking credit. He was happy to share his material. We've read stuff where there are other, graduate students who he just gives all his data to and doesn't worry about whether he gets the credit for. I think it didn't concern him a lot whether people thought that it was Jack Calvin's work or his work, or not that we've ever read anyway. But
so
yeah.
Was Jack Calvin a marine biologist or something of that nature too with ecology? Was he here during part of the time that some of this material was written?
Yeah, oh yeah, he was absolutely here. I'm asking Susan to confirm that, but
he really was from Sitka, Alaska?
I think he moved to Sitka, Alaska after that.
Yeah,
oh,
but
okay.
he was not out there collecting data like Ed Ricketts does, and collecting the data and putting it in files and numbering and cross-referencing and being a scientist. He might go out there with Ed Ricketts and collect with him, and lots of people probably did that, but Ed Ricketts was the person who was making the notation, collecting the notation, organizing it into these usable chunks of information. So
well, it's just really interesting that the man's name is on the book and there's very little information about him. I'll look him up.
Yeah,
I can tell you, he was a writer. He went to school in Mountain View and then was in Carmel. It could have been at Calvin's house that Steinbeck and Ricketts met. And so he was a writer of boys' books, and I have a copy of one on my shelf, but I don't see it right now, adventure stories. And so, but he was only here, I think he left in 1931. So he worked with Ricketts a little bit in the late 20s and 30s. He claimed it was his idea to write the book, but I'm not sure of that. So there is kind of if you go to Sitka, Calvin was an ecologist then and kind of a major figure in Sitka. I actually went up there a couple of summers ago and his granddaughter was in the class. So I had to tread very carefully when I talked about between Pacific tides. So I did quite a bit of, sort of background on Calvin, but he basically then became a journalist ecologist and lived up in Sitka, but his name was on the book initially, and he was the one who did some of the photography and did a little bit of help with the writing and with the collecting, but nobody will know how much. And he certainly left the scene. I mean, it took another 10 or 8 years to get it published. So a lot of that was Ricketts' own work, but he kept Calvin in the loop. I don't know if that answers it, but
yeah, thank you, Susan.
Sure.
But I am going to say one last pitch, which when you look at the data and the science, I'm 100%, this is all Ed Ricketts' effort. I mean, not 100% of his effort, but this is going to happen.
You could see the book happening without Calvin, but you can't see the book happening without Ricketts.
Right.
No. But if he was only really involved maybe 2 or 3 years of the entire time, that really wasn't enough to do as much as Ricketts did for all the information he accumulated.
Yeah, it's really an expression of Ricketts.
Yeah, interesting. Has Calvin's name been reproduced on the later publications of this book too?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting thing that he's not mentioned much. But thank you. Thank you.
Well, Steve and Mary, thank you so much for being here with us and for showing us your beautiful film. This was a lot of fun. Thanks again to the Monterey Public Library for putting these events on, and to all of our participants for your great questions, your participation, and for being here each week. Next week at the same time, we have a film. Next Thursday at the same time, we have a film about the Western Flyer and Ricketts and Steinbeck's voyage down to the Sea of Cortez. So I hope that you'll join us next week for that. And we look forward to seeing you then. So thanks again, Steve and Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
Yeah,
It
we had
was
a good
super-
time.
Incredible colored photography in your film. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Absolutely
Thank you
beautiful.
very much.
Did
I
you
hope
two
that-
do that? Did you do the filming?
We did.
Yes.
Oh, it
16 hours.
was fantastic.
Yeah,
Really
but
incredible.
Hours and
Thank
hours
you.
that aren't in there that aren't so nice. But
But the way the music was in certain places and the pictures were really tremendous. I'm going to have to watch it again.
oh,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve and Mary.